Living in the quiet suburb of Salem, Massachusetts, my life was as mundane as it could get. My name is John, and I was a history professor at a local college. My days were filled with lectures and grading papers, until the day Nora moved into the house next door. Nora was an enigma. She arrived in the neighborhood on a dreary afternoon, her belongings packed into an old, rusted truck. She was tall and slender, with raven-black hair that cascaded down her back like a waterfall. Her eyes, however, were what struck me the most. Deep, dark pools that seemed to hold secrets from another world. Our first encounter was brief. I was tending to my garden when she approached, offering a polite smile. "Hello, I'm Nora. Just moved in next door." "Hi, I'm John. Welcome to the neighborhood," I replied, extending a hand. Her grip was surprisingly firm, and as she looked into my eyes, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was an odd sensation, one that I couldn't shake off even after our brief exchange. The first few nights after Nora's arrival were uneventful, but things soon began to change. It started with small, almost imperceptible events. Lights flickering, strange noises in the dead of night, and an unshakable feeling of being watched. At first, I attributed it to my overactive imagination, perhaps fueled by the countless horror stories I had read over the years. One evening, as I sat in my living room grading papers, I heard a faint whisper. It was so soft that I could barely make out the words, but it sounded like someone was calling my name. I brushed it off as the wind, but the whispers grew louder and more persistent with each passing night. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to dig into Nora's background. What I found was unsettling. Nora had lived in several towns across the country, and each place had its own set of mysterious, unexplained events following her departure. There were rumors of witchcraft, but nothing concrete, just whispers and shadows. My neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman with a penchant for local folklore, confirmed my suspicions. "They say she's a witch," she whispered, her voice trembling. "She's been chased out of every town she's lived in." I laughed it off, but deep down, I felt a growing sense of dread. The supernatural occurrences in my home were becoming harder to ignore. Objects moved on their own, shadows danced in the corners of my vision, and the whispers had become a constant companion. Determined to get to the bottom of this, I decided to confront Nora. One afternoon, I knocked on her door. She answered, her expression unreadable. "John, what a surprise. What can I do for you?" "Nora, I need to talk to you about the strange things happening in my house. Ever since you moved in, I've been experiencing unusual events." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm sure it's just your imagination, John. Salem is a place full of history and mystery, after all." Her words did little to reassure me. As I left her house, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of my descent into a nightmare. The days following my confrontation with Nora were anything but normal. The strange occurrences in my home escalated rapidly. The whispers that once seemed distant now filled my ears with a cacophony of indistinguishable words. I could no longer dismiss them as figments of my imagination. One night, as I lay in bed, I felt a sudden pressure on my chest. My breath hitched, and I struggled to move. Through the darkness, I saw a shadowy figure at the foot of my bed. It had no distinct form, just a mass of darkness that seemed to pulse with malevolence. The figure slowly approached, and just as it reached me, I bolted upright, drenched in sweat. The figure was gone, but the fear lingered. Desperation drove me to seek help. I confided in my colleague and friend, Mark, a fellow history professor with a keen interest in the supernatural. Over coffee in a dimly lit cafe, I poured out my experiences. John, it sounds like you're dealing with something beyond our realm of understanding, Mark said, his brow furrowed with concern. Salem has a dark history with witchcraft. Maybe there's something more to Nora than meets the eye. I was hesitant to believe in the supernatural, but the evidence was becoming harder to ignore. Mark suggested visiting a local historian who specialized in Salem's darker past. Dr. Alice Pembroke was a renowned expert on the Salem witch trials and the occult. Dr. Pembroke's office was a treasure trove of ancient books and artifacts. She listened intently as I recounted my experiences, her expression growing graver with each detail. "Nora Blackwood," she muttered, sifting through a stack of old documents. "I've heard that name before. She's rumored to be a direct descendant of one of the witches executed during the trials. Her family has been linked to several unexplained events throughout history." My heart pounded in my chest. What can I do to stop this? Dr. Pembroke handed me an old, leather-bound book. This contains records of rituals and protections against dark forces. It might help you understand what you're dealing with. I thanked her and left, feeling a mix of dread and determination. The book was filled with archaic language and cryptic symbols, but I was determined to decipher it. The whispers in my home grew louder, and the shadows seemed to close in around me, but I couldn't give up. I had to find a way to stop this. Back at home, the supernatural activity reached a fever pitch. Objects flew off shelves, doors slammed shut on their own, and the temperature plummeted. Each night was a battle to keep my sanity intact. I slept with the lights on, but it offered little comfort. One evening, as I pored over the ancient book, I heard a loud crash from the living room. I rushed in to find my bookshelf toppled over, books scattered across the floor. Among the debris, I found an old photograph, black and white, showing a young woman who looked strikingly like Nora. She stood in front of a house that bore a resemblance to mine. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the implications. Nora wasn't just any witch. She had a connection to this place and possibly to me. The shadows seemed to whisper her name, and I felt a sense of impending doom. I decided to confront Nora again, but this time I was determined to get answers. I marched to her house and knocked on her door with a newfound resolve. She answered, her eyes narrowing as she saw me. "John, what brings you here again?" "I found this," I said, holding up the photograph. "Who are you, really?" Nora's expression softened, but her eyes remained guarded. "Come in, John. We need to talk." I stepped into her dimly lit living room, where the air felt thick with tension. She gestured for me to sit, and I noticed the room was filled with peculiar artifacts. Old books, strange symbols, and candles that seemed to flicker with an unnatural light. "Nora, what is going on? Ever since you moved in, my life has been turned upside down. I need to know the truth." She sighed, her eyes reflecting a deep sadness. "My family has a dark history, John. The women in my family have been accused of witchcraft for generations. We possess certain abilities, but it's not what you think. We're not evil." "Then why is this happening to me?" I demanded, my voice trembling with frustration. "Because you got too close," she replied softly. "The spirits are trying to protect me, but they've misunderstood your intentions. They see you as a threat." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. I had unwittingly become entangled in a centuries-old curse. But now that I understood the root of the problem, I felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps there was a way to end this torment. As I left Nora's house, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. The shadows seemed to follow me, and the whispers grew louder. But I was determined to find a way to stop this. The ancient book Dr. Pembroke had given me held the key, and I spent every waking moment studying its pages. The more I read, the more I understood the nature of the curse. It was a protective spell gone awry, a dark force that needed to be appeased. The book hinted at a way to neutralize the spirits, but it required a deep understanding of the old magic. I delved deeper into the ancient book, learning about the spells and rituals that might help me counter the curse. Every night, as the shadows grew longer and the whispers more insistent, I scribbled notes and devised a plan. I realized I needed more than just knowledge. I needed evidence. I had to prove to myself and others that these events were real. I set up cameras around my house, hoping to capture the supernatural phenomena. It wasn't long before they yielded results. I reviewed hours of footage, seeing objects move on their own, shadows with no source, and even spectral forms appearing and disappearing. The evidence was undeniable, and it strengthened my resolve. Armed with my newfound knowledge and proof, I returned to Nora's house. This time, I wasn't going to take no for an answer. She opened the door, her expression unreadable. "Nora, I need your help to end this," I said, holding up a flash drive with the footage. "I have proof of what's happening. We need to stop this before it destroys both of us." She hesitated, then nodded. "Come in, John. Let's discuss what needs to be done." We sat at her kitchen table, the atmosphere thick with tension. I showed her the footage, and she watched in silence, her face pale. When it was over, she finally spoke. "The spirits are more restless than I thought," she said. "We need to perform a ritual to appease them." I felt a surge of panic. "A ritual? I thought we could avoid that." "It's not the kind of ritual you're thinking of," she reassured me. "It's more of a plea for peace, but it will require both of us to be fully committed." As we planned the ritual, Nora opened up about her past. She was indeed a descendant of one of the witches executed in Salem, and her family had been cursed ever since. The women in her family had tried to live normal lives, but the spirits of their ancestors always followed, bringing chaos and despair. "My mother tried to break the curse," she said, tears glistening in her eyes. "She failed and paid the price. Now, it's up to me to protect myself and anyone who gets too close." Her story filled me with a mix of empathy and fear. I realized that Nora wasn't the villain of this story. She was a victim, just like me. We had to work together to break the curse that bound us both. As the date for the ritual approached, the supernatural attacks intensified. My house was in a constant state of disarray, and I could barely sleep. The shadows seemed to take on more defined shapes, and the whispers turned into screams. I was at my breaking point, but I knew I had to hold on. Nora and I gathered the necessary items for the ritual: herbs, candles, and a special talisman that had been passed down through her family. We decided to perform the ritual in my house, the epicenter of the disturbances. The night of the ritual was stormy, with thunder rumbling in the distance. We set up everything in my living room, the flickering candlelight casting eerie shadows on the walls. Nora began to chant in an ancient language, her voice steady and strong. I joined in, my voice trembling at first but gaining confidence as we continued. As we chanted, the room grew colder, and the shadows seemed to gather around us, drawn to the power of the ritual. Suddenly, a gust of wind extinguished the candles, plunging us into darkness. I felt a cold hand grip my arm, and I nearly screamed, but Nora's calm presence kept me grounded. The spirits were not going to let us go without a fight. The air crackled with energy, and I could see faint figures moving around us. Nora's chanting grew louder, more insistent, and I matched her intensity, pouring all my fear and determination into the words. There was a moment of intense pressure, as if the very air was pressing down on us, and then, with a final burst of energy, the room was flooded with light. The shadows dissipated, and the whispers ceased. The air felt lighter, and I knew we had succeeded. In the days that followed, my house returned to normal. The oppressive presence was gone, and I could finally sleep peacefully. Nora and I remained in contact, bound by our shared experience. She continued to live next door, but the aura of dread that once surrounded her had lifted. I spent a lot of time reflecting on what had happened. The experience had changed me, made me more aware of the unseen forces that can shape our lives. I realized that my initial fear and suspicion of Nora had been misplaced. She wasn't an enemy, but a person struggling with a burden too great for one person to bear. One afternoon, as I was tidying up my study, I found a letter slipped under my door. It was from Nora, thanking me for my help and explaining that she was leaving Salem. She needed to find a place where she could start fresh, free from the shadows of her past. I felt a pang of sadness but understood her decision. As I looked out the window at her now empty house, I noticed something strange. The old photograph I had found was lying on my windowsill, but this time, the woman in the picture was smiling. A serene, peaceful smile that hadn't been there before. It was then that I realized the true nature of the curse. It wasn't just about darkness and fear. It was about finding light and understanding amidst the shadows. And as I stood there, I felt a sense of closure, knowing that Nora and I had both found a way to move forward. Life in Oaxaca had always been peaceful for me. My name is Marco, and I worked as a tour guide in this historic city, known for its vibrant culture and rich traditions. My days were filled with showing tourists the wonders of Monte Alban and the bustling markets of the city. But everything changed when I met Las Brujas. It was a sunny afternoon at the Mercado de Benito Juarez. The air was thick with the scent of spices and freshly baked bread. I was shopping for my grandmother, who had fallen ill recently, when I noticed a group of women gathered around a stall selling herbs and potions. They were unlike any vendors I had seen before, their eyes sharp and knowing. One of them, an older woman with silver hair and piercing green eyes, approached me. "You seek something for your grandmother's health, see?" she asked, her voice smooth and inviting. Surprised, I nodded. "Yes. How did you know?" She smiled, revealing surprisingly sharp teeth. "We know many things. Come, let us help you." I followed her to the stall, where the other women watched me with interest. They introduced themselves as healers, gifted with knowledge passed down through generations. They offered me a mixture of herbs, assuring me it would help my grandmother recover. Grateful, I accepted their gift and hurried home. My grandmother, Abuela Maria, took the herbs, and within days, she seemed to improve. The women's reputation spread quickly in our neighborhood, and they became known as benefactors with mysterious, almost magical powers. But soon, strange things began to happen. At night, I would hear whispering voices outside my window, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. Shadows moved in ways that defied logic, and I often felt an unseen presence watching me. One evening, as I was walking home from work, I saw the women standing in a circle near the edge of town. They were chanting softly, their voices blending into a haunting melody. I felt drawn to them, but an overwhelming sense of fear held me back. They noticed me and stopped, their eyes reflecting an unnatural glow. "You should not have seen this, Marco," the silver-haired woman said, her voice echoing in my mind. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. From that night on, the strange occurrences became more frequent and more terrifying. It wasn't long before I realized that these women were not simple healers. They were Las Brujas, witches with powers far beyond my comprehension. The supernatural events that plagued my nights began to seep into my days. Doors slammed shut without warning, objects moved on their own, and the air in my house grew heavy with an oppressive energy. My grandmother, once improving, fell ill again, this time with an inexplicable malady that left her bedridden. Desperation gnawed at me. I had to understand what was happening, and more importantly, how to stop it. I turned to the local library, searching for any information on witchcraft and local legends. My research led me to an old book about the history of Oaxaca, which mentioned Las Brujas in chilling detail. Determined to learn more, I visited Don Luis, a local historian and an expert on Oaxaca's darker past. His home was a treasure trove of old manuscripts and artifacts, each with its own story to tell. I explained my situation, and he listened with a grave expression. Las Brujas are not to be taken lightly, he said, handing me a worn book. They have been part of our history for centuries. These women possess ancient knowledge and powers that can bend reality to their will. They often disguise themselves as healers to gain the trust of the unsuspecting. What can I do? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. They've targeted my family. How can I stop them? Don Luis sighed, his eyes filled with pity. There is no easy answer, Marco. They are deeply rooted in the old ways. Confronting them directly is dangerous, but sometimes knowledge and courage are the only weapons we have. Armed with this new information, I decided to confront the women. I found them at the market, their presence as unsettling as ever. The silver-haired woman greeted me with a knowing smile. Marco, how is your grandmother? She asked, her tone mocking. I took a deep breath, summoning my courage. What are you doing to us? I know who you are. I know you're Las Brujas. Her smile faded, and a dangerous glint appeared in her eyes. Careful, Marco. You are treading on dangerous ground. Leave us alone, I demanded, my voice shaking. I don't want any more of your help. The other women closed in, their expressions cold and menacing. You cannot simply walk away from us, one of them hissed. We have chosen you for a reason. I backed away, my heart racing. As I turned to leave, the silver-haired woman called out, her voice dripping with malice. You will regret this, Marco. You and your family will suffer for your defiance. That night, the hauntings grew more intense. My grandmother's condition worsened, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I knew I couldn't fight Las Brujas alone. I needed help, and I needed it fast. The next few days were a blur of terror and confusion. The hauntings became relentless. Shadows with glowing eyes stalked me. Disembodied voices whispered threats, and the temperature in the house fluctuated wildly. My grandmother's health declined rapidly, her once strong spirit now a shadow of its former self. I felt a growing sense of helplessness. Every attempt to reach out for help seemed to be thwarted by an unseen force. Friends and neighbors who once offered support now avoided me, their eyes filled with fear and suspicion. It was as if Las Brujas had cast a pall over my entire life. In my darkest hour, I remembered Diego, a childhood friend who had moved away years ago. Diego had always been fascinated by the supernatural and had even studied under a shaman in the mountains of Chiapas. I reached out to him, hoping against hope that he could offer some insight. Diego arrived in Oaxaca within days, his presence a much-needed beacon of hope. We sat in my living room, the flickering candlelight casting eerie shadows on the walls. I recounted my experiences, and he listened intently, his face growing more serious with each detail. We're dealing with powerful forces, Marco, he said finally. But we're not powerless. We need to confront them directly, but we must be smart about it. Diego and I spent the next few days devising a plan. We researched the legends and consulted with Don Luis, piecing together a strategy that would allow us to confront Las Brujas without falling into their traps. It was a risky plan, but it was our only hope. We decided to lure Las Brujas to a neutral ground, a place where their powers might be less effective. There was an old abandoned church on the outskirts of town, a place that had once been a sanctuary for those fleeing dark forces. It seemed fitting that it would serve as our battleground. As we prepared, the hauntings grew more intense, as if Las Brujas sensed our intentions. I knew that the coming confrontation would be the most dangerous moment of my life, but I was determined to end the terror that had consumed my family. The night of the confrontation arrived, shrouded in an eerie silence that seemed to weigh down the air. Diego and I made our way to the abandoned church, our hearts pounding with a mix of fear and determination. The moon cast long shadows on the cracked stone walls, and the wind whispered through the empty pews. We set up candles around the church, their flickering flames casting a dim light. Diego placed protective charms and herbs around the entrance, hoping to weaken the influence of Las Brujas. We waited in tense silence, every creak and rustle heightening our senses. It wasn't long before we heard the approach of Las Brujas. They entered the church with a confidence that sent chills down my spine, their eyes gleaming with malevolent intent. The silver-haired woman led the group, her presence commanding and terrifying. "Marco Diego," she said, her voice echoing through the empty space. "You cannot escape your fate." Diego stepped forward, his voice steady. "We will not be your victims. This ends tonight." The air crackled with energy as the confrontation began. Shadows danced and twisted, and the women chanted in a language that sent shivers down my spine. Diego and I stood our ground, reciting the protective words we had learned. The candles flickered wildly, their lights struggling against the encroaching darkness. In the midst of the chaos, a revelation struck me. Las Brujas weren't acting out of pure malice. There was something deeper driving their actions. I remembered the stories of persecution and fear that had followed them for generations. They were fighting to survive just as we were. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice cutting through the turmoil. "This doesn't have to end in destruction. We can find another way." The silver-haired woman paused, her eyes narrowing. "What do you suggest, Marco?" "Understanding," I replied, my heart pounding. "Let us find a way to coexist. You don't have to be our enemies." For a moment, silence filled the church. Then, slowly, the women lowered their hands, the dark energy dissipating. The silver-haired woman studied me, her expression unreadable. "You speak of things you do not understand," she said. "But perhaps there is wisdom in your words." In the days that followed, the hauntings ceased. My grandmother's health slowly improved, and the oppressive energy that had plagued our home lifted. Diego and I kept our promise to seek understanding with Las Brujas. We learned more about their history, their struggles, and the reasons behind their actions. Life in Oaxaca began to return to normal. The market buzzed with activity, and the air was filled with the familiar sounds and smells of the city. My grandmother, though still weak, regained her spirit, and I felt a renewed sense of hope. Diego decided to stay, helping us navigate this new relationship with Las Brujas. One evening, as I was walking through the market, I felt a familiar presence. The silver-haired woman stood by a stall, her eyes meeting mine with a hint of a smile. "You have changed things, Marco," she said softly. "But remember, the line between good and evil is thin. Stay vigilant." As she walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that our story was far from over. The memory of those haunted nights would always linger, a reminder of the delicate balance between light and darkness. And as I looked around at the bustling market, I knew that understanding and compassion were our greatest weapons against the unknown. Thank you for watching our stories. Did you enjoy it? What do you think could have happened next? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you want more stories based on real-life events, click on the video appearing on your screen now. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more thrilling tales. See you in the next video.